So good morning. So good to see all of you out this morning. Today I want to talk about unkept promises. How many of you have suffered the defeat of an unkept promise at some point in your life? How many of you have failed to keep a promise that you made? That's why you don't make them, huh? We're going to talk about that. That's good. That's good. Are promises meant to be broken? Like, you remember that? Like, kind of growing up, you said to a friend who did not fulfill a promise, hey, you promised. Promises were meant to be broken. It seems like we live in a world where oftentimes that feels like the case. I cannot tell you how many times I have made the mistake of a handshake deal. Anybody done that? Right. Like where you come to an agreement with somebody and they're going to do something. I'm thinking very specifically at our former house. We had two instances pretty close together. One with an excavation company or guy where we had some to me, we had very clear understanding of some work that was to be done and a range of what that would cost. And about halfway through the job being done, I was getting these intermittent bills, and the bills were already past the range that we talked about for the whole project. And so I'm wondering what's going on here. And so obviously there was some kind of disconnect. I clearly had made the mistake of not having in writing exactly what we were going to do, but always the fool to make the same mistake more than once. I did it again shortly after for another project, and similar kind of thing happened. It was a pay the person for the work as they're doing it kind of thing, with an understanding of about what it was going to take and what it was going to cost, and again, just wildly out of control. And so since then, I have again, and probably again, done, I don't know about you, but sometimes I fail to learn my lesson. And so I have started to value much more highly, like having things written down, like having some kind of recorded, all right, this is what we talked about, this is what we agreed to, because, as much as I might like to think that I'm trying to bring into any of those arrangements as much integrity as I can, right, and I think I am, but perhaps I'm mistaken in that, or perhaps I'm right, and it's just like this is the world I live in, where people, they make gestures, they make promises, they make commitments, and then ultimately are unable to, or perhaps even unwilling to fulfill them. And so we do get into this world where we do have a lot of paper, right? There's a lot of paperwork. We recently refinanced our home, and so I possess now, a folder, about this thick with paperwork that is essentially promising in a variety of ways I'm going to pay back this loan. Right, and we create all kinds of things. I mean, I think it's, to me, it's a little funny. I mean, I guess I get it, but I don't think I've had to do this yet. When you go into court and you're on the witness stand and you swear, right? You make an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. And to me, there's like a little bit of a disconnect from like what should be the normal, ordinary course of our communication, right? Like my default way of being ought to be, not that it is, but it ought to be, I'm going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Whether I'm in a court of law or I'm just talking to a friend or some other person that I happen to be associating with. And so I get that, okay, well, in this particular setting where there's a lot at stake, it's almost a solemn reminder, hey, you really, 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 really need to tell the truth in this regard. But then we do that, and we carry that into some of our normal conversations and dealings with one another, right? We'll say things like, well, to be perfectly honest, as if a lot of what I had said previously or at other times wasn't perfectly honest, right? So we almost have to elevate, okay, listen, what I'm about to say, I want you to trust things that I've said before, but what I'm about to say, you really, really gotta trust me on this. Anybody pinky swear before? Right? Has that gone out of style? Yeah, I don't know, kids still do that, but that for some reason that was a big deal when I was growing up. So ultimately the problem is we just can't trust each other, right? There's really at the heart of our relational issues in this world, how we actually do life with each other is to a great extent, we can't trust each other. I don't know about you, I'm a little jaded, right? I'm jaded by what have been some of my experiences that are going to probably alter how I, or perhaps should alter how I, do those same experiences in the future. I think about all the stuff that we have to buy and get, and it breaks down. I mean, I just feel like my life is full of stuff breaking down right now. Companies not coming through with what they said they were going to do. This week, my daughter's phone started failing. And, phones don't have any real working parts. So you kind of expect, even though they have a 1-year warranty, they should last longer than that. And so, we're a little beyond a year, and now all of a sudden she's, trying to get this thing figured out, and it looks like it could be broken, it might need to be replaced. It's like, come on, really? It's like, that's an expensive purchase. That's an expensive repurchase, right? Why can't people make things that will ultimately kind of perform as we expect them to do? It just doesn't feel like there's a lot of integrity there. Think about our relationships. Today we're gonna spend a little time talking about relationships that fail, specifically marriages that fail, right? From a percentage standpoint, we would expect in this room about 50%, perhaps even a little higher, but about 50% of us have at some point had a marriage relationship that has failed, right? A marriage relationship that we probably embarked on with a certain understanding of what, what that life would look like and what it would be like, and then one day it wasn't, right? And so that failed. We've experienced failed friendships. I think about people in my life that I don't even necessarily have a reason or understanding of why perhaps a friendship failed, but just again, another kind of experience that we have in our world. What about, how many of us have, probably all of us, I imagine, we have relationships in our families that have failed, like with biologically united human beings, a relationship with a mom or a dad that's failed, a grandparent or children, brother or sister, right? We have these relationships that we think that, hey, family bonds are supposed to be really, really tight. I mean, how many of us have experienced family relationships that have not ultimately lived up to what we would expect them to live up to? So again, all this just kind of feeds into this. Man, it's really, really hard for us to trust one another. And so we are looking at, over the course of this series, some of the things that Jesus brought to the kind of the surface of conversation about these pitfalls that can really derail our relationships. And so the pitfall we want to talk about today is unkept promises. And these unkept promises, as you'll see from the text, come in marriage relationships and also in our relationships with one another. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 5, Read verses 31 through 37 together here. And again, so Jesus is, the whole construct of this thing is Jesus is taking what has, for generations and generations, been known as the law. Like these are the laws that we live by. These are the laws that rule our society. These are the laws that help determine how we relate to one another. And so Jesus he's picking on some of these individual laws, and he's saying, okay, you've heard it was said, or for you it has been interpreted that you understand the law in this way, but I say to you, and he reveals something kind of new and fresh, a whole different perspective on that. And so in week 1, we talked about the law of murder, right? The law says, do not murder another person. And Jesus said, but I tell you, if a person is angry without cause toward his brother or sister, toward another fellow human being, then it's categorically similar to murdering that person in your heart already, right? And so we talked about that. And the last couple weeks, we talked a little bit about our human sexuality. Jesus, he said, the law says, do not commit adultery, but I tell you, if anybody lusts after another person, then he or she has committed adultery with that other person already in their heart, right? So he's bringing this new perspective, and he goes on, and he says in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 31, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. So this is the common understanding. This was a rule or a law within Jewish society that a man, at this time, very specifically, a man, a lot of times when we read in the Bible, we can, and we hear the language of, brother. Oftentimes, we in context, we know that really that's understood to be like brothers and sisters, or if it's talking and using some male language, oftentimes it's just general and talking about people as a whole. But here, very specifically, in Jesus' day, the rule was, if a man divorced his wife, he must give her a written notice of divorce. And I say that specifically because women didn't have the right to do this. Like, this was not a woman's right to divorce her husband for some particular cause. It was only within the man's right to divorce his wife. And so the rule was, if you divorce your wife, you must give her a written notice of divorce. And that was ultimately prescribed so that the woman was free from the binding nature of that marriage to that individual, and was now free to marry somebody else, as obviously the man was free to do that as well. But Jesus says, but I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in a case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, and now we're going to kind of like jump into a whole other topic, related, but a whole different topic. Again, you heard it was said to our ancestors, you must not break your oath, but you must keep your oaths to the Lord. But I tell you, don't take an oath at all, either by heaven, because it is God's throne, or by the earth, because it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, because it is the city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, because you cannot make a single hair white or black. But let your yes mean yes, and your no mean no. Anything more than this is from the evil one. Okay, so we have these two kind of things that we're going to try to tackle this morning. This teaching on divorce and this teaching on the taking of oaths that ultimately have in common an issue of integrity, right? An issue of honesty, an issue of people making promises to other people and either fulfilling those promises or not fulfilling those promises. So let me begin with a caveat. This is not something I love talking about, okay? I mean, I wish the Bible said way, way more about heaven and how beautiful and awesome it is, and we could just come here and like, oh, let's talk about heaven, right? It's this thing that we're looking forward to. We talk about something like divorce. I understand and recognize this can invite a lot of hurt, right? Again, like nobody here should be, like, I don't want you to feel like you're being singled out. And there's some people in here that are like, you know what, Josh, you can talk about divorce. Like, there's nothing you could say that would make me feel bad about leaving that guy or that girl, right? Like, it was so, like, there's just nothing you could say. It's like, okay, that's great. But for others, I know this is, if you've experienced the pain of divorce, there's a good chance it was very, 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 very painful, like life-alteringly painful. And I just want you to know that, like, first of all, I recognize I'm sensitive to that, and I don't want you to feel like you're being singled out, right? Probably the majority of us in this room have experienced the pain of divorce, okay? So just, like, I don't want you to interpret, like, when we talked about something like a marriage that has failed, like that somehow also makes you inherently a failure, right? Like, I mean, you are a failure. But you're sitting in a room with a whole bunch of other failures, right? And unlike when you were in school, and your failure may have been graded as a bigger failure than the student sitting next to you's failure, or your failure certainly paled in comparison to the success of, other students who are getting A's and B's. Like, when we're talking about real life, there is a commonality among us that we just need to recognize, that we are failed human beings, okay? Last week, we looked at the story of the woman that Jesus met at the well. She was married 5 times, right? 5 times. And you know what Jesus did? He pointed it out, right? Like that was kind of a big part of the thrust of the message last week, was that Jesus he went there with her on what I'm sure was a very, very painful, sensitive topic for her. But you know what? She did not walk away from that encounter with Jesus feeling hopeless and helpless and hurt and abandoned and confused. Think about how she left the presence of Jesus. She left proclaiming to her whole town, "You have got to meet this guy." And so, as we get into this, I just want you to know, my hope, my prayer is, regardless of how I fail in even communicating something as difficult and as sensitive as this, that we walk away having had some encounter with the presence of Jesus that gives incredible hope, regardless of the situations maybe that we've experienced in our past or even that we're experiencing today. All right, so let me just say, church should be a place where we can come as we are, right? And I hope that whether you have been coming here for a long time, this is your first time ever being here, I hope that we are learning as a community of people that the church ought to be a place not where we get to show off like how well we polished our shoes and our belt buckles and our halos, right? Like how well adorned we have managed to make our lives look to other people. But this is a place where we can come as we are. And as we come as we are, we're pursuing an ethic of righteousness, right? Like that's what this is all about. We're pursuing an ethic of righteousness, an ethic that Jesus is introducing through this entire Sermon on the Mount. We pursue righteousness. Righteousness is that it's right conduct with others that results in right relationship. Like that's the ethic we're pursuing. And we have to recognize that in that pursuit, there's nothing we can do about our past. There's nothing you can do about it. The past is the past. There's nothing we can do about our past. There's also nothing we can do about what others do. You can't control the actions or the intents of another person. What is ultimately required of you and I, of you and me, we're required to pursue righteousness. We're required on our end to practice right conduct toward others with the hope that it will result in right relationship. So we're asking the question, as we do each week, what does righteousness require? When it comes to our relationships with one another, specifically our intimate relationships, whether we're married or whether we are in a significant relationship, what does righteousness require? What does righteousness require of me? I'm married, so what does righteousness require of me toward my wife? If you're married, what does righteousness require of you toward your spouse? Specifically, what does right conduct look like and mean for you toward your spouse that will result in right relationship? If you're not married, if you're in a relationship with another person, right, and you refer to that person as your boyfriend, girlfriend, your significant other, whatever, this is also a question for you to wrestle with. What does righteousness require of you? What does right conduct of you toward that person require in order to produce and promote right relationship? And so Jesus is talking about divorce here, right? So you've heard it was said, if a man divorces his wife, he must give her a written notice of divorce. Now, in Jesus' day, the abuse of divorce was rampant, right? So divorce was happening, and it was incredibly unjust and unrighteous. First of all, like I said at the outset, it wasn't even the right of a woman to divorce her husband within Israelite society. Only the man could do it. So, I mean, obviously there's something wrong about that. But then even the grounds by which a man could divorce his wife was just incredibly unjust. And you know, it came out of, in the book of Deuteronomy, where we see this commandment given regarding divorce that Jesus seems to be kind of loosely quoting. There were like these split schools of thought about what were satisfactory grounds for divorce, right? There was this one school of thought had a very narrow view, a very narrow scope. Jesus seems to have also kind of had in mind this very narrow scope of, all right, here are legitimate grounds for divorce, right? That probably were limited to something like infidelity or some kind of other, you know, sexual brokenness that had a real catastrophic effect on the one flesh nature of that marriage relationship. But then there was this other school of thought that became kind of the prevailing school of thought that had a very broad view that would grant a divorce to a man for practically any reason. I love what Charles Quarles wrote in his book on the subject, and I just want to read it. It's kind of lengthy, but I just want to read it to you. And so here he's talking about the grounds for divorce a man could use to really get rid of his wife. He talks about the Mishnah, so this composition of rules that regulated Jewish life. The Mishnah specified numerous and ridiculous grounds for divorce that made the covenant of marriage meaningless. Okay, and so that's kind of really where the big problem was. You have people entering this covenant of marriage, aka making promises one to another, and the grounds that permitted divorce were so broad, it basically took those promises and negated them. It made them pretty meaningless. The Mishnah stated that a man could divorce his wife if she were barren, if she became a deaf mute, or if she had epilepsy, tetanus, warts, or leprosy. You're going to get more uncomfortable than that. Okay, just hang on. A man could divorce his wife if she failed to perform certain services in the home. Each day she was required to grind flour, bake bread, wash clothes, cook food, nurse the children, make the beds, and weave the wool. There's like women in here all over the place going, amen. Hello, can I get some help, please, right? And then there's some rules about if she brought, a certain number of servants, then she could get some relief from some of those duties. But ultimately, if her husband considered her lazy, he still had the prerogative to divorce her. Rabbinic law also stated that certain physical defects in the wife were so offensive that they were legitimate grounds for divorce. The general principle was any physical defect or blemish that was serious enough to disqualify a man from the priesthood, right? So there were these rules about who could become priests, and some of those rules pertain to the actual physical body, right? So if a man possessed certain physical characteristics, he was actually excluded from even being able to become a priest. And so if a woman had some of those same characteristics, well, naturally, that should be grounds for divorce, right? Because they were, quote unquote, sufficiently repulsive to serve as a ground for divorce. Consequently, a man could divorce his wife if she had a head that was wedge-shaped. When I read this, I felt like we should organize ourselves according to head shape. It'd be just really interesting to do that and take like a panoramic of here's Curtis Lake, right, and all their many heads. Wedge-shaped, turnip-shaped, or hammer-shaped. Or if her head was otherwise malformed, such as sunken or flat in the back. All right, so a lot of different head issues. He could divorce his wife if she had poor posture or if she had thinning hair. He could divorce her if she had no eyebrows, only one eyebrow, or hang on, bushy eyebrows, okay? He could divorce her if she had a pug nose. The condition of her eyes was particularly important. If she had eyes too high or too low, if she were cross-eyed, had no eyelashes, had eyes of two different colors, watery eyes, or eyes big as a calf, or small like a goose, any of these justified divorce. The man could divorce his wife if her nose were too big or too little, her ears were too little or too floppy, if she had an overbite or underbite, missing teeth, a poor figure, a swollen belly, a protruding navel, oversized or damaged sexual organs, a dark complexion, bony ankles or knees, swollen feet, if she were bow-legged, suffering from swelling of the big toe, if her heel had protrusions, if the sole of her foot was as wide as that of a goose, or if she were ambidextrous. And that's all it goes on. It's funny. It's also like sad and revolting, right? But I read that because like I want us to get a sense. I want us to have a sense of how flippant, specifically men, how flippant society had become toward the covenant of marriage. It was so easy to dissolve that marriage for essentially any reason. And I don't know about you, but I find that to be very reflective of the way we treat marriage today, right? Like we have such a low view of marriage that although it might not be written in quite the same way, the grounds for which oftentimes divorce is sought are probably grounds that we should take on a little more strongly to think, yeah, that's not necessarily legitimate. I'm not saying it like that. That our marriages don't have challenges in them that ultimately feel like are too big for us to overcome, and like there's nothing we can do about it. But there's directionally, I think, if you're a follower of Jesus, directionally, there should be a higher view of what is the covenant of marriage. Jesus says the man that divorces his wife, gives her the letter of divorcement, and then sends her on her way, Jesus says he causes her to commit adultery. And causes the person that marries her to also commit adultery. The logic is essentially like this. Jesus says when two people marry, they become one flesh. That there's a union that actually transcends like what we go to town hall for, right? I need my marriage certificate that in the eyes of society binds two people together with certain legal requirements and privileges that can only ultimately be dissolved by also going to that same society and having, that certificate essentially rescinded. But Jesus, he's leaving on the table this understanding about the nature of marriage that says when two people marry, they become one flesh. That's it. And so when a man sends his wife away, although in the eyes of society, they're no longer together and she's now free to marry somebody else, that one flesh union persists. Right? That it's not dissolved in exactly the same way as what society has done with that marriage. And so now, as she begins a relationship with another person, with regard to that initial one flesh union, they have committed adultery. And it's, the man who has divorced his wife that Jesus says is causing that. Right? That's what he's kind of bringing to the surface. And so we have to, again, this is not something I'd expect people in the world or people that aren't followers of Jesus to understand or even appreciate. But if you are a follower of Jesus, there has to be, this doesn't solve every problem, but there has to be a high level view of what does this one flesh union actually mean? And what does the law of a better righteousness require of me with regard to my spouse? If you are married, what does righteousness require? Now, part of the problem with why marriages so oftentimes are dissolved is because we're really broken with how we enter into marriage. Or our understanding of what marriage is really all about. So we could ask ourselves, well, why do we get married in the first place? Why do we even do that? Many of us, probably most of us, grow up with a kind of fairy tale mindset that says, hey, you're supposed to grow up, fall in love, and get married, become complete, right? That's the chain of events that happens in the life of a person. But that's a really poor understanding of the creation narrative that talks about the first marriage. Ultimately, we go into marriage to get something, right? We go into marriage because we want to get something from another person, where we should be going into marriage to give, and not just to give something, but to give everything, right? That's what the one flesh union's all about. It's not about me going into a relationship with another person so that person can complete me or make me whole, right? Because prior to that, I'm not a whole being. It's not that. We're not supposed to go into marriage to get something. We're supposed to go into marriage to give, to actually give everything. And so when we have this understanding that my marriage is intended for me to get something and I'm not getting that something, whatever that thing is, well, why wouldn't I dissolve the marriage, right? And seek that something in somebody else. But again, has a warped understanding of the creation narrative. I want to read for you when God created Adam and Eve. Here's a little of what is said there in Genesis chapter 2. It says, the Lord God took the man, right, took Adam and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and watch over it. And the Lord commanded the man, you're free to eat from any tree of the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For on the day you eat from it, you will certainly die. Then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper corresponding to him. Right, so God, as he looks out and evaluates creation, right, there are all these animals, right, all these different created beings that God has put in the sky and on the earth and in the sea, right, and they all have these counterparts that allow them to reproduce, right, to perpetuate their particular species. But with regard to the man that God created, there was nothing like him. There was no one like him. And so God says, it's not good for the man to be alone, even in the middle of this beautiful world that I've created, where he has ultimately everything that he could possibly need, except for one really important thing, and that is relationship. And so I need to make another who can help him, first of all, with the task that he has to do, but also to provide for what is missing, or what God described as not good. Now, the problem is, like, we look at Adam's aloneness, and we make that kind of synonymous with singleness, right? We say that Adam's singleness presently is the same thing as aloneness. Now, God was not, what's really important for us to understand is that God was not trying to correct what we would know as singleness. God was trying to correct aloneness. We look at singleness oftentimes and we equate it with aloneness or loneliness. We think, a person that is in their late 20s, in their early 30s, or has gotten into their 50s, a man or a woman that has never married another person, and like we have this idea, this sense that that's kind of weird. And I can't tell you how incredibly wrong it is for us to have that perspective, even that gut reaction, like that there's something perhaps wrong with this single person who has never married another. Like we need to correct our theology that understands and raises singleness to a life that is exactly as good as marriedness, right? But we haven't done that. Like we've had a tendency to make this mistake of elevating marriage to something greater than it was ever meant to be. See, with Adam was actually alone. There was literally no one else, right? And that's what God said. He said, it's not good for man to be alone. But that's not the case anymore. Like, there's literally no one of us alone. I mean, look around. I mean, maybe there's somebody online right now watching who's alone, but you're not really alone, right? Like, you're going to go to the marketplace. Like, the world is full of human beings. So the kind of aloneness that Adam experienced and that was being talked about here is not the same as what we understand singleness to be today. In fact, singleness is our natural mode, if you think about it. Singleness is our natural mode. How many of you were born married? Anybody? Like, you were born married, it didn't work out, and so, no? Right? No, we start single. Like, that's our default mode. Now, yes, I guess most people get married, and so I can understand why we're conditioned to think that is the quote-unquote normal projection of the human experience. But, like, we have to get off of that. And here's why. Like, we actually do harm and damage to individuals by trying to make their singleness seem as if it's some kind of deficiency in their lives and their being, right? And so a person rushes into a marriage that either they or the other person are not prepared for, and that marriage is doomed for failure from the start. Or when a marriage, say, does fail, right? Again, like, there's just something inherently wrong with being single, with being without another person, that, like, now this person rushes into that next. I mean, how many times have we seen that? Maybe you've experienced that, right? Like, you went from one relationship right into another one because, like, we're conditioned to think that that's how we're supposed to be, and there's something wrong with us if we're not. And so we need to appreciate singleness. We need to appreciate, like, what it means for a person to be complete and whole and entire in and of themselves, even prior to an intimate relationship with another person. In fact, Marriage was never intended to bring two incomplete people together to make one complete person. That is not what the one flesh union is all about, right? How many of you, anybody been to a marriage ceremony? Yeah, okay. So like you've heard that language, right? Right? The two become one flesh. What does that mean? Well, what it's supposed to mean, what's supposed to characterize that coming together is one whole, entire, complete being joins with another whole, entire, complete being, and the two of them become one whole, entire, new, complete being. Their identities are not lost, right? Their individual, single identities persist in that relationship, but something amazing is like that's why it is such a catastrophe for that one flesh union to ultimately be dissolved. And so when we have a better understanding of singleness, a proper view of singleness, the beauty of like it's possible for a person, it's actually possible for any person to have a completely fulfilled and satisfactory life without having a sexual relationship, an intimate relationship with another person. Like that is possible. In fact, I think if God had his way, he would urge us, hey, let's you and I get in a really, really healthy place together before you try to do this with another human being. Right? Because when we bring our whole, complete, healthy selves into a marriage relationship, oh man, how much, now we're talking about a marriage that isn't trying to complete or fulfill or do the kind of job that it was never designed to do for somebody. But what it's doing instead is it's taking a person and it's elevating the experience. It's making marriage into the beautiful thing that God intended for it to be. So that's kind of the first mistake. The second mistake, I got hurried, but the second mistake is, treating as if it weren't important at all, right? So we make this mistake that, well, marriage is going to solve my problems, so I get married, right? Or, and that becomes what it is. But this other issue is we treat marriage as if it weren't important at all, right? So we have lots and lots of people, some of us even, like we're doing things with another person that we should only be doing in marriage, right? What we're doing is we're treating marriage as if it's not important. It's like, well, if I can move in with this person, if I can do married people things with this person that I'm not married to, like, I'll just say it, like have sex, like buy a house, like have a kid, or all right, we're not ready for a kid, we're gonna have pet, like we start doing married people kinds of things, but without the covenant of marriage undergirding that, right? That's treating marriage as if it's not important at all. That's one human being saying to another, hey, I'm gonna give a part of me to you, right? I'm gonna give a part of me to you to get back a part of you for me, right? That's what's happening in this kind of a relationship, as opposed to the covenant of marriage that says, I'm going to give you all of me, and you're going to give me all of you. And then for when we're in a marriage, if we treat marriage too lightly, then it's easy to dispose of it, again, so that we can, try to get from another person what the first person didn't give us. So, anyway, there's a lot there, and what do we do? I mean, like marriage is hard, right? Marriage is difficult, right? Practically any relationship, any meaningful relationship with another person is oftentimes hard. But again, I just like directly, I want us taking a step toward the idea that marriage is this beautiful thing that God has created, this beautiful thing that God has designed for us. And he wants us to fulfill our promises to one another. Jesus goes on and says, again, you have heard that it was said, don't break your oath, but you must keep your oaths to the Lord. But I say, let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything more than this is from the evil one. Jesus was here. He was attacking this world in which he lived that, like, systemically was dishonest. Just this reality that people had a tendency to manipulate one another, to take advantage of one another, to not come through on the promises that they had made to each other. And Jesus says, for those that are going to follow me, this will not do. Like, we can't have that in the kingdom that I am establishing, the kingdom that I am building with each of you. We need to have an integrity about us where, like, it doesn't require for me to elevate my speech by saying, okay, now I'm telling you the truth, or now I'm going to be honest, or now I make this promise. Jesus says, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. And so when it comes to our relationships with one another, much like the marriage relationship, what does righteousness require? It requires that we practice honesty in our speech toward each other, that we develop and show integrity in our character. That is, like, even the unseen, invisible parts of me are lining up with the parts of me that you do see, right? And then when there's failure in either of those areas, there's a humility that is willing to recognize that failure and work to make it right. Jesus recognizes that swearing an oath, it presumes on the future, presumes on, every time we make an oath, every time we take on, some particular promise, there's a presumption. And so there's this kind of like base level problem or difficulty with that. Why? Because I don't know the future. I don't know the future. Like, the prevailing attitude I need to have is, God's in control of my day and my days. God's in control of what happens tomorrow. That's why Jesus says, listen, you can't even make one hair on your head turn black or white. How many would love to just be able to go, right? And like, I don't know, make hair come out, for some of you, or at least change its color or change it back to what it once was. Jesus says, you can't do that. And presuming on the future, presuming on, these parts of our existence that, really are only within the realm of God's sphere and space. It's as silly as thinking that you can control the way your hair comes out. And so in this world where dishonesty is systemic, like it's built in, that's why we have lawyers and laws that clarify laws, and then more laws written to fix the broken law, like all these laws. Jesus is just calling us, be honest with one another. Show integrity to one another. What would it look like? What would it look like if, again, there's nothing we can do about other people, there's nothing we can do about our past, but just given our present circumstances, right where we are right now, from this day forward, what would it look like if husbands and wives acted righteously toward one another? Like, actually acted righteously, actually pursued right conduct toward one another. If people prior to being married to another person, if people prior to that marriage covenant, what if those two people acted righteously toward one another? Like, oh, she's so pretty and I want her so bad, right? But like, what if those two unmarried people said, I'm not going to settle for giving you a part of me in exchange for a part of you, but we're going to do this the way Jesus would have us do it. We're going to elevate, like, if we want to be together, we're going to elevate our understanding of marriage, that covenant, that promise that we're going to make. And we're going to do married people things within the context of that marriage. What if in our dealings with each other, all the Christians were honest? What if we lacked duplicity? What if we were unwilling to try to manipulate other people to get our way? Imagine if the followers of Jesus kept their promises. Imagine the kind of shift that we would be able to see taking place in our world. Amen? Let's pray. Father, I thank you for the promises, first of all, that you have made to us, and that you always keep your promises. Lord, may that inspire us to do the same for one another. Lord, if we're here today and it is true at this present moment that we are somehow acting unrighteously toward another person in our lives, God, would you just convict us of that? Would you give us the grace and the mercy that we need to change our course and to pursue righteous relationship with each other? Lord, I pray for marriages that are experiencing difficulty. for relationships between two people where there's a lot at stake. They're not sure which way it's going to go or how it's going to go down. Lord, I pray for those that are feeling the pressure maybe to enter into a relationship just because of the condition of our society that exalts marriage as like the highest virtue of living. Lord, I pray that you would just help us to look at what it means to have real integrity in our relationships and our dealings, both with you and with each other. And I pray that you would help us, Lord, in those areas where we struggle the most. I pray these things in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. I'm going to invite you to stand. Caleb's just going to lead us in this song as we close out this morning. Caleb, you wrote this song. So we've sung it a few times. It's a beautiful song. And so Caleb wrote these words. He says, the promises you give or your endless faithfulness, I will not forget. I don't know about you, but I'm glad that I serve a faithful God, one that I can lift up because of his faithfulness to me. I pray that as we reflect on that, it will help us in our faithfulness with one another as well. Amen. Let's sing it together.